have to go through the one office, and then you go through the other office. And if I had any advice for Mr. Leonard, I would say he should make his chair a bit higher so that he's even taller when and he should wear high-heeled shoes. So they were incredibly wealthy. And you know, I mean, just another lesson. When it comes to war, you should never want to fight a war. You should be so powerful that people don't even want to start with you. That's what should actually happen. And by the way, that applies to business as well. I'm a business person. In our business, the company that I work for is the biggest market research company in the world. And one of our business methods is to be so powerful that people don't want to pick a fight with us. They just go and work in some other part of the market. How did they get so wealthy? Have a look at Egypt. There's a picture. And I'll point out some of the unique geographical characteristics. The first thing about it was the flooding of the Nile. And these are things I'm sure you would have learned. Every year, and they didn't know why this happened. Every year the Nile, it would rain heavily in Central Africa, water would flow down into the Nile, and the Nile would flood. And every year the water would bring with it this incredible topsoil. And so if you were an Egyptian, you'd move away, and the flood would come down, and it happened every year. And it would flood the plain. It's a huge floodplain. If you look very carefully at the map, you can see the difference between the main river and the floodplain. The main river is very thin, and the floodplain is a lot wider. And then the water would flow out into the Mediterranean Sea, and you'd have topsoil. You wouldn't have to do anything. You wouldn't have to fertilize. The water was wet. You wouldn't have to do anything except plant stuff. And in a world where food was the most valuable thing you could have, there was nothing more valuable. I mean, gold was valuable, but gold was hard to get. The most valuable thing you could have was food. And Egypt produced so much food that they had, it was like having huge gold mines, endless gold mines, that they were able to feed themselves and feed everybody else. The basis of Egypt's wealth was the food. It was like having a country that was just one huge gold mine. And they didn't have to work very hard for it. That's how they got wealthy. Everybody else wanted the food, they were able to take food to the rest of the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing about Egypt is it's actually hard to get to. These days it's not hard to get to. We just climb an airplane and off we go. But in those days it was difficult. Why? Because you had mountains to the south and mountains to the east. And desert everywhere. So if you took an army and you went into Egypt, what happened? There was just desert. No water, no food, nothing, and mountains you had to cross. And then you had seas to the north, and you had the sea. On this other side you had the Red Sea. And the only piece of land that you could go through was this narrow piece of land at the top there. It was like having a big house with a very narrow door. Foreigners couldn't get into the country, so it was very easy to defend. The basis of the empire, the reason it lasted so long, was because it was easy to defend and incredibly wealthy. And then they used the river to transport stuff, so it was very easy to get stuff backwards and forwards inside the country. Here's how they built a picture then of themselves as very wealthy, so that people, and powerful, so that people wouldn't invade the country. And I'm going to take a short break. This is called a brain break. Last 30 seconds, and then I'll wrap everything up. glasses on. Just make sure you're not falling asleep. Okay, so imagine now you're the government. You've got a very wealthy country, but not many people are wealthy. You know, most people are quite poor. But the average Egyptian was a lot wealthier than everybody else. The average European, you know, so the Egyptians were living in houses like this, okay? The average Egyptian was living in a house like this. The Europeans were living in caves. The average Egyptian had proper clothing. The Europeans were running around with animal skins and stuff. So even though they were what we think of as poor, they were a lot wealthier than everybody else. So you're very wealthy. That makes it possible for you to build a very big army. You know, because soldiers don't have to actually do very much. They just sit around and kill people. That's like not very productive. So, and you can pay the soldiers because you've got all this food. But now what you want to do is you want to create an impression of power so that nobody thinks of harming you. The starting point is to say that your king is a god. What could be better? Your king is a god. So the first thing they do is they take the pharaoh and they make the pharaoh a god. This makes the pharaoh much more intimidating than just a human king. Including to the own people, you know, including to the ordinary people. If you look carefully at Egyptian history, you'll find out that just like Jesus, the pharaoh comes from God. The pharaoh didn't like, it wasn't like the mom and dad got together and out-hopped the pharaoh. That's what we would think. No. Their story is that the pharaoh actually comes from God, but happens to end up in the mom's tummy. That's what they thought. Not very different from Mary. They used this device of the huge house, so that with a tiny entrance, so that if you were visiting, you had to walk past all these important people before you got to the person you were visiting. In this particular case, you had to go through 5 stages before you got to the person that you were visiting. They built huge buildings so that human beings visiting would feel small and look around and imagine how powerful this was. And then they told heroic stories about their own generals in battle. So this is a picture of a general fighting in the south of Egypt. You can tell that it's the south of Egypt because they're fighting mostly black Africans. And they are olive skinned and so on. And the picture is of all the enemy being killed. This is from the newspaper. This is what they brought back. They told the stories of how they were doing. This is what they told the pharaoh. They distorted the truth a little bit, as newspapers do, in order to sound more powerful. So they had great public relations. Let's sum up then. 1, they were racist. 2, they were corrupt. 3, they had a crime and squatter problem. 4, the richest people were educated people, generals and armies. 5, you wouldn't want to be the pharaoh. Because if you were a pharaoh, there's a very good chance that your grandchildren would be killed by somebody else wanting to be the pharaoh. And lastly, they were specialists at intimidation so that nobody would invade them and ordinary people wouldn't stir up a revolution. You never had to worry about ordinary people killing you if you were the pharaoh. The people who killed you were the people in your closest family. No revolutions. As a result, it's the most successful empire that the world has ever seen. It lasted 2,700 years, and we will never see it again. And they created really beautiful. Question. The question here is were they allowed to kill their family? The answer is of course not. They weren't allowed, they weren't supposed to kill the family. It's just that's what people did. You'd have a jealous brother or a jealous cousin or something like that. And so you kill your cousin and be the king. What could be more natural? Yes, sorry, question I've seen you as well. Yeah. Sorry? I can't hear the question.
When did they get actual money?
The Chinese seem to have been, we know that the Chinese were the first people to invent paper money. But what happened, if you look at the history of money, what happened is to begin with, people just traded whatever they had. So we had a barter system. So you trade your goats and your cattle, and the very early money was actually pieces of coins, pieces of metal with cattle on them. So you wouldn't give somebody your cow, you'd give them a piece of coin with a cow on it because you did have a cow, and if they want to come fetch the cow, they could. And so that's how money evolved. And then the other thing is precious metals became money automatically. So gold has for a long time been money. Does that help to answer your question? Back over there, and then, yeah. You'll need to stand up and shout. Yeah, they thought, didn't they worship cats?
Thank you, boys and girls.
Clap, go like this and say 3, 2, 1. In those days, I don't know, I've got you, there was somebody over there, and I'll come to you. In those days, human beings generally tended to see, to believe that spirits were in everything. So there's a spirit in a human being, there's a spirit in cats, and there's a spirit in crocodiles, and there's a spirit in the sun, and there's a spirit in dogs and everything. And so it was possible, if you thought, as long as you thought the spirit could be very powerful, it was possible for the spirit, for that thing to become a god. And so there would be people who thought that the spirits of cats were very powerful and they worshipped a cat. But you could actually end up worshipping anything. Question over here, and I've got you at the back. Yeah. How else? How old? You could become the pharaoh, or actually the women were also called pharaohs, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, you could become a pharaoh at any age, as long as you were the eldest child of the one who just died. So Tutankhamun, for example, was a pharaoh. I think he was 13 or 12 or 14. And then what would happen is you'd be looked after by your cousins and by the priests and so on until you got older. But you'd be the pharaoh very young. Right at the back. If you were fat, could you get through the door? I really don't know. You know what? I don't think people got that fat in those days because they weren't as bad as we were. I really don't know. Was that your question? I don't know how heavy the pharaohs were, but they were carried around they never walked anywhere. If they went anywhere, they got put into these little cubicle things and they were carried around, so they couldn't be too fat. We've got a question over here. And a question over here. Sorry. So, yeah, your question.
Why were the king why were they being racist to each other?
Why were they being racist? That's a really good question. And I could give you a short answer or a long answer. And I think you deserve something